Mountain bikes have rocketed through their half-century of revolution, from clunkers to the wild, diverse selection of off-road beasts we've now got. And we've seen a wild evolution in what mountain bikes need in regards to their hoops. We're going to go on a journey from pre-mountain bike rims of choice to highlight the wide-ranging trails that we can now ride, and what happened to wheels in this half-century of development. OK, we're not going to dwell too much on the clunkology, as I feel, well, the story's been told by lots of people who were there at the time. And with that kind of cross-pollination of ideas brings lots of diversity to the perspective of what's happened. Essentially, in the late 70s, Joe Breeze, Charlie Kelly, Gary Fisher and other members of Mount Tam Velo began riding converted fat tyre single speeds up and around Mount Tamalpais. Then, well, precise details depending on who's retelling the story, but essentially gears were melded onto these single speeds. Then things really changed. 1977, we've got the legendary Repack downhill race. It was a catalyst for many. Later in the same year, Breeze made his first production run of proper mountain bikes. OK, technically it was only 10 mountain bikes. For me, I think that kind of counts. And one of the driving forces behind that design, and lots of the designs of these clunkers turning into mountain bikes, was the easy-to-access, toughish, dependable-ish 26-inch tyre. The 26-inch by 2.125 Uniroll knobby tyre, mounted often to Schwinn S2 rims. These were alloy rims, but they were steel alloy, and they weighed, well, depending on who you chat to, around 3.4 pounds. In new money, that's almost 1,500 grams. And they were chrome-plated, not just for cool looks, but to, well, stop them rusting away. But that shiny chrome, well, it didn't really play nice with rim brakes. Mountain bike, one word, went wild. One word? Well, yeah, that was the original company name for mountain biking, started by Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly, and they were selling Tom Ritchie-made frames. And pretty much exclusively, those complete bikes were 26-inch. But Fisher, who was one of the first originators to put gears onto those clunkers, was always experimenting. There was some early experimentation by Ritchie and by Gary Fisher with both 650B and 700C, both, well, tyres and wheels. 700C, I should say, is what 29er tyres are made from. And the tyres that they got were imported from Finland, of all places. But the 26-inch tyres were more widely available in US at the time. And you might be wondering, well, if 650B is better because it's bigger, why are we not reminiscing about 650B tyres? Well, those bigger tyres, which were great for riding, were expensive, really expensive, 10 times as much as the 26-inch knobbies. And the final nail in these bigger wheel size options that were initially available was that the US BMX market came out with some new cruiser BMX rims in a 26-inch size. These new alloy rims offered, well, a real weight saving and better braking performance. And with that, the die was cast, and 26-inch wheels was the size of choice. Well, at least for another couple of decades, but more on that bit later. Whilst the wheel size settled to 26-inch, everything else about mountain biking went through an absolute space race of growth. And whilst that first proper race was a downhill race, XC racing and XC riding started to charge ahead too. With that exponential growth came hundreds of new technologies, from proper group sets that clicked through multiple gears and shifters that migrated from being sort of modified down-tube roadie shifters to, well, proper thumb shifters on the top of handlebars, and loads of other enhancements. Whereas those early mountain bikers had just one tyre to choose from, now there was a mountain of different knobbies to choose from. There was sizes too. So opposed to having just effectively a 2.1 tyre, there was 2.25, there was 2.3, there was even 2.5 tyres. And designers were using real trail riding conditions and specific insights and genuine supercomputers to help develop new grippy tyres. Whilst the core of the growth of the sport was folks like you and me, the weekend warriors, brands were investing heavily in racing, in both to teams and new technology that racers needed to win at the very highest level. impactful. And I feel perhaps it was an echo of those really early mountain bikes being, should we say mass challenged, aka heavy. Mountain biking went through a bit of a weight weenie problem and everything was being trimmed down or narrowed down. So rims especially, well, their rim width stayed really narrow and really slim to save weight. Rims like Sun's Mistral were a great example of sizing on many rims in the early 90s era. And, well, we should flag that braking was mostly rim brake. Canties were king, so we're dragging a rubber block on the rim. So rims need a braking surface. XC did seem a real driver for bike evolution, but as the zeitgeist began to shift and extreme sports started to grow, especially in the mid to late 90s, races like the Kamikaze DH and the Reebok Eliminator held on the ultra-long, ultra-fast, and when I say fast, I mean 50 miles an hour fast, 50 miles an hour, not Ks. It's on Fire Road and it was on Mammoth Mountain, but it really started to morph the sport. Whereas we had one bike to do the sort of full spectrum of riding, this DH racing and those kind of racers' needs really created a separate evolutionary branch for bikes and core wheel development. Mountain biking, even with its broadening spectrum, was still on the up, and racing was still seen as the best way to promote and develop better parts. But now we were lifted from these kind of lightest equals fastest constraints that XC had put on us, and lots of tech that, well, wasn't viable before because we've got this sort of weight weenie mindset was now viable again. And suspension wasn't new per se, but DH racers wanted more, and they were less concerned with these limitations of weight. So bike development accelerated, and as bikes got faster, well, bikes need to get slower as well. And we switched from, well, these kind of antiquated things where we're pulling a rubber block onto the rim to disc brakes. And they made a huge difference, not only to stopping distance, but rim design. By removing the need of having a braking surface on the rim, designers and engineers were free to optimise rim designs in ways that were previously just impossible. This brought a new generation of stronger, stiffer, wider, and overall better rims. Disc brakes were proven to be the way forward with brakes, but the wheel revolution was far from being finished. The status quo of wheel size was broken, well, actually it's up for debate because it could be, well, as early as Jeff Apps, Google him, could be Bruce Gordon, or it could be Wes Williams. I mean, the first mass-produced 29ers were from Gary Fisher's bike brand, Gary Fisher. The changes in wheel size did drive further development. At first it was just 29er, but very quickly the mid-size 650B, well, more of it's a rebirth of 650B, and it was rebranded as 275. So 650B is the original name for this wheel size. And whilst, well, both of those wheel sizes could have been much bigger, we could have adopted them much earlier, this time it actually stuck. So now we've got options of wheel sizes, and that makes a big impact onto wheel development. Rims were redeveloped to better match the different requirements that these newer, bigger hoops have. Okay, they were heavier because they're bigger, and whilst carbon rims have been around before, the low weight needs of especially early 29ers, I think really helped accelerate their development. Reynolds were one of the first carbon wheel brands on the roadside, and they entered the mountain bike carbon wheel world in 2008 with the MTN-T and the MTB-C, pulling across huge amounts of carbon engineering and production design know-how to set a new standard in lightweight carbon wheels. And I say a new standard, and you're thinking, oh, I'm sure that's great, but it was used by more riders than any other, the 2008 worlds, than, well, any other carbon wheel. It was impactful. While some riders are still debating wheel size and which is best, there's another wheel-related technological leap forward that still causes some very heated debate. Yes, tubelessness. That's right. The first iteration of tubeless was a little bit odd. The UST, so that's a Universal System Tubeless. It was spearheaded by French brains and French brands, and it needed dedicated rims and dedicated tyres. But kind of interestingly, it didn't run any sealant, which, as you might imagine, was, let's say, interesting, because it only half delivered on the high hype of less flats. I mean, you could just say it was a bit of a letdown, really, couldn't you? But to those that believe, a tubeless conversion is a no-brainer. With a good setup, you'll get less flats, you'll get more grip, and you'll have a bike that rolls faster. I guess the key in that statement is a good setup. One brand that worked hard to drive the second generation of Tubeless was Stam's No Tube. They developed lots of the tubeless tech that we now use, sealant included. Their patent on their innovative rim profile technology was used by many brands. Sunringlate included used the profile. In 2011, Reynolds introduced its first 100% tubeless ready carbon wheel in its line with the MTN 29er, the MTN XC, the MTN AM. They were the first tubeless ready carbon rims. It's impressive stuff. In this brave new tubeless and bigger wheeled world, whilst the DH and Freeride wheels and rim profile had ballooned out quite a lot, XC had stayed, well, quite static in both rim size and tyre size. After the 29er growth, brands were more open to experimentation. Fat bikes, which were originally designed with monster width rims and monster width 4-inch plus tyres, which offer really amazing traction and sort of floatiness on, well, soft terrain, be that snow or sand or maybe even extreme mud, were tipped to be the next big thing to hit the mainstream. Whilst full-on fat tyres can be fantastic in that deep sand or deep snow, they aren't perhaps the kind of do-it-all that I think many brands thought they were. So, after the fat bike boom, we had another wheel size format inflate up. This was plus size. Plus size was meant to be this sort of bridging gap between the still cinny cross-country and trail tyres that were trapped for too long in, well, just over 2-inch tyre size, and then the full fat at 4-inch size. So the first plus tyres were meant to be around 3 inches, but many in reality only came up as about 2.7 inch. And you might be wondering, why aren't we talking about plus bikes much? Why aren't we talking about plus tyres? Well, it's mostly because plus bikes sort of melted away. And that's because, well, bikes' clearance for tyres and rubber, like the tyres, actually grew. So trail and even XC tyres grew up. They got bigger. XC now is 2.4, Enduro is 2.6. And thankfully, during this tyre size growth, many wheel brands saw the potential to innovate further and play with rim width, as a wider rim profile can help better support these wider tyres, especially when set up tubeless. Rim profiles have slowly, incrementally widened. So in 2014, Reynolds' tubeless-ready MTN wheel line expanded, and that inner channel, that inner width, did get wider. So 2014, we're talking about an inner rim width of 19. For a 29er trail, it was around 21. And then for an all-mountain 27.5, it was 23. But by 2019, just the XC rim from Reynolds, the BL309 or the 289, had grown. So it had grown from that 19mm, which we talked about in 2014, all the way up to 30mm in the front and 28mm in the rear. And it was increased because, well, finally, cross-country racers had realised that bigger tyres can be faster. Oh, thank God. Conversations about rims is great, but what's going on in the centre of the wheel? Well, lots happened to the fulcrum of the wheel, the hub. Well, we've got to kind of like get back to basics. There's a lot going on with the rear hub especially. We've got to lace the spokes into it. We've got to mount gears to it. We've got to ensure that those gears have got the right space to spin and coast. We've got to bear in mind it needs to spin straight and efficiently too. Bearing, yeah, okay. Speaking of bearings, some brands have held out to older cup and cone style, and technically they are adjustable. So you've got ball bearings that are loose, then you've got these cup and cone assemblies inside. And yeah, technically under certain loads, they can roll faster, but they do need more maintenance. So thankfully, lots of brands have moved to the modern era and spec hubs with, well, better lasting, easier to replace, and just all round better bearings, which are sealed cartridge bearings. The earliest of mountain bikes used tandem hubs for strength, but as gears developed, early mountain bikes borrowed from the best roadie hub technology, and they got cassette hubs. They had quick releases, so it's a QR axle. And very quickly, the sort of standard in mountain bike became 100mm up front, and the rear hub rear spacing was 130. Some of the early hubs used a screw-on gear cluster, which was sort of called a screw-on. But higher spec bikes used Shimano's latest tech at the time, which was a 7-speed cassette hub. And, well, as brands like Shimano and Suntour moved up in gears, rear cassettes grew, and that meant that the sort of standard, well, had to grow. So we moved up from 130 to 135 rear hub spacing. In the late 80s, Shimano introduced Hyperglide, which was a new sprocket and, well, freehub design. At its core, it allowed the new cassette to be sort of slid on. And it also allowed the chain to go onto 2 cogs at once, which made shifting much, much faster. The Hyperglide cassette and the freehub standard, also known as HG, is still a standard now. So screw-on cassettes were a hassle to remove and replace. So the cassette technology was a worthy sort of upping of these standards. The QR, well, that stayed a standard for a really long time. But with the wide adoption of disc brakes, it meant that, well, more changes were essential. Well, first up, you've got to make space for mounting the disc. So that sort of eats into your overall space. First, and you might have one at home if you're vintage like me, there was a 4-bolt standard, then 6-bolt, which has stayed around for a long, long time, much like HG. Only more recently, it was joined by Shimano's Centerlock standard. But disc brakes and QRs aren't really a happy combo. Even early disc brakes are much more powerful than rim brakes, and where that power is applied near the centre of the hub, it means that QRs are easy to sort of overpower and the wheel could move. As you can imagine, your wheel moving in your frame or in your forks isn't great. First, it was suspension forks that grew bolt-through axles. And it wasn't just for disc brakes, but it was also better for, well, forks being sort of torsionally stiffer for better control. And the first bolt-throughs were, well, 110 by 20 mil. That's a standard that's still around for downhill now. That 135 rear spacing did morph into the 12 by 142 bolt-through. And yes, it was a new humper standard, but the cassette and the disc rotor are still in the same place in relation to the sort of the hub centre line, or this wheel dishing, as a standard 135 QR hub. So some hubs and some frames could be converted. And it meant if you're a frame designer, it wasn't kind of having to rewrite the whole book. So many bikes at the time were still running triple chain sets. First Ritchie, then SRAM pushed sort of 3 gears into 2 gears with a wider range cassette. And then SRAM pushed things even further by developing a 1-by drivetrain where you've just got 1 cog at the front. The rear cassette is now loaded with, opposed to, well, 8, we're up to 11 speed on the back. With the largest cog, it has to kind of lean over the spokes if you're looking from the sort of the back of the bike, just to squeeze them in that narrow rear spacing. So SRAM decided that a better system for mounting the rear cassette was required. HG, or Hyperglide, had been really good, but SRAM decided it was time for something better and moved to XD, which was first for 11 speed, or 7 speed in DH, but then for 12. When Shimano added an extra cog and went up to 12 speed, they also updated their freehub standard. So now effectively we've got 3 freehub standards. We've got MS, or microspline, we've got HG, Hyperglide, and then we've got SRAM's XD. The last big update to hub spacing, well, it's a real big boost to boost spacing. So on the front, we're changing from 100 by 15 to 110 by 15. And on the back, we're going from 135 by 12 to 148 by 12. The logic from SRAM, who helped develop the standard, was that this wider spacing for the fork and the rear frame allowed for more clearance for bigger tyres, more clearance for the drivetrain, and stronger wheels. Now, you might wonder, how are we getting stronger wheels from this wider hub? Okay, if you imagine a hub, and we're looking kind of, well, front end on or back end on, where you've got the spokes and they run up and create a triangle, well, if you can make that lower section of the triangle wider, it can make it more stable and stronger. So if you imagine on the rear wheel especially, because we've got the cassette, we've got to step it in and dish the wheel, because it's not symmetrical, it's an offset back wheel. So by evening out these spoke mounts, where the spoke flanges are on the hub, we can get a boost to stiffness and a boost to triangulation, and that's what it's all about. We've covered all the wide ranges of how wheel tech has changed, but we've not touched on how it's all laced together. Yes, we need to chat about spoke pattern, spoke count, and the spokes themselves, because they all matter to how a wheel rides and how it performs for you on the trail. There's been wide experimentation on spoke materials too. So as with many things mountain bike, steel was used first. Then some brands tried aluminium alloy, others used carbon fibre in terms of either like a weird flat plate style or composite whole wheel or individual strands of carbon. Others also tried aramid sort of, well, string for want of a better word. But Many brands, I feel rightly so, have migrated back to steel. Steel is a fantastic material for spokes. It can be butted and it can be bladed, and it offers a really high strength, especially in the package confinements that you have in a wheel. It offers the best ride quality, really good ease of service, and a really long life. It's long lasting, and it's much more readily available than some of those unique spoke materials that are out there. For example, Sapim, who's the spoke brand that Reynolds uses on its wheels, has a century plus of spoke production under its belt. I've talked about spoke material, but what about the number of spokes? Yeah, this has definitely changed. Those tandem hubs that I talked about early on that were on those Klunkers and pre-mountain bikes, they had loads of spokes. And some of that was because, well, the parts weren't that good quality. So the spoke count had to be high to try and keep that rim nice and strong and true. But as rim material has got better and rim quality has got even better with carbon, we can reduce the spoke count down. And the pattern of those spokes has changed a little bit. We're still crossing them over because that allows for a little bit more strength. And we've talked about spoke material, and we also need to touch on how, well, there are now J-bend and straight pull, and both have got advantages. Lots of rims and hubs and combinations of wheels used to run J-bend, and it was the go-to. But I would say in the last decade, we've sort of morphed into using straight pull spokes. They can be slightly stronger, and whereas they used to be unique and hard to find, now they are the go-to spoke for many a wheel. So, where do we go from here? One of the big development areas has been carbon fibre rims. They allow engineers to play around with things like layup and weave and adding material. And by adding material to the rim profile during the construction, it's given the composite engineers lots of bandwidth to build stronger and better while still being lighter. Reynolds have started to use a proprietary IDM, impact dispersal matrix material. It sounds jazzy, but they created one of the first carbon DH wheels to last a complete race season, including a full World Cup race season, city races and Red Bull Hardline under Pivot Factory Racing Bernard Kerr, which is a reason why Reynolds back up their wheels with a lifetime warranty. Where mountain biking goes next is, well, very hard to imagine. It's just been such a wild ride so far. But some things are certain. We're going to need wheels where we're going, and engineering advancements are going to continue to develop and deliver better and better wheels. Where and how we ride them? Well, that's open to wherever the future trails flow to.